Hi guys, welcome back. This is the concluding part of the saving and retrieving images from Sqlite database in Android. If you are hitting this video for the first time, please take a peep back to the first part of this tutorial. So let's continue. We've actually added the logic of getting the image, whereby we use the image picker and you could select from the gallery or take a selfie from the device camera. But we just have the image populated to an image view. But we need that image to be saved into an Sqlite database. So how are we going to go about this? So let's take a deep dive into the source code. In the main activity, you trigger the add to DB method when you click on the button add to DB, which is actually going to run this chunk. But before I continue with this, I would like us to understand some aspect of the code. You have to create the DB helper, you have to create the database, you have to create the table, you have to create the content provider. So let's get through that in HEV. Heading straight to the DB helper. This is a class that extends the Sqlite Open Helper, and you declare the database name called image.db, likewise the database version. This is a context, which is like for this particular activity, an object of the Sqlite database, and the content resolver to access the content provider. We only have a column called the column name since we are only dealing with just an image. We are not adding some metadata to the table. You have to declare a table name called image table. Cool. And in this, we have the DB helper constructor that takes in the context as its parameter. Also, it calls onto the superclass, passing the context, the database name, and the database version. We initialize the content resolver so that it's going to be usable. Likewise, the DB. This time, we get the writable database since we are writing to the database. In the onCreate method, declare a final string called SQL create image table. In this string, you have to declare the SQL syntax to create the table. Now we are creating the table with a table name with an ID, which is an auto increment ID. This is actually going to be a primary key, and the column name, and this is going to be a blob data type. If you are dealing with images using the database, we recommend you to opt for the blob data type, and it shouldn't be null. So we have that passed in. You call on the DB object and execute the SQL to create the image table. So you log that to the console that the database created successfully. Cool. Now the add to DB method. This takes a byte array of image. It's a byte array. So that's the parameter that this takes. And you call on the content values since we want to add some stuff to the database. Created an object called CV, and we put into the column name the image bytes array we got. After that, you trigger the DB to insert the table name and the content values that you have. So this is actually going to insert the image into the column name, which is actually a blob data type. On upgrade, very important, you need to override two methods anytime you extend the Sqlite Open Helper, which is the onCreate and onUpgrade. OnUpgrade takes the DB, the old version, and the new version. These are the three parameters needed, and this is actually going to drop the table if it exists and create another one. Cool. From here, we can easily look at the provider since we have a database created with a table that has two columns, the ID and the column name. Now the content provider is going to be built on top of the database. This is actually going to access the database where you can do the CRUD implementation. We've covered extensively when it comes to content provider in previous tutorial. You declare a URI matcher, which is actually a content URI for the pictures table or pictures with an integer of 100. Let's not forget the images provider must extend the content provider class. You also declare the picture with an ID, that's one picture. This is for all pictures, while this is for a specific picture with an ID. That's the URI matcher. You need a content authority, which is a name for the entire content provider, similar to the relationship between a domain name and its website. A convenient string to use for the content authority is the package name for the app, which is guaranteed to be unique on the device. So we actually opt for the package name, very unique. And you have to use the content authority to create the base of all URIs which apps will use to contact the content provider, which is the base content URI that actually creates a URI pass content / concatenate with the content authority from the base content URI. Also, you need a path to the images, which is the path to the table, which we declared, and the content URI itself, which you appended the path to the URI based on the base content URI you created, and the path to the tables, which is the path images. After that, you will need the URI matcher object to match a content URI to a corresponding code, which we declared right here. And a static initializer is to run the first time anytime anything is called from this class. In this static initializer, you add the URI to the content URI patterns that the provider should recognize, which is the add URI, the content authority, the path images, and the pictures. These are the three parameters you need to form all pictures URI matcher. Now for the pictures with ID, you pass in the content authority, the path images, and the wildcard with the pictures ID. Cool. We created the DB helper object since we are going to be accessing the database. In the onCreate method, you initialize the DB helper so that it's going to be usable. Anytime you extend the content provider, you need to override some methods, which is the query, the insert, the get type, and the delete and update method. We're actually going to be using the query method because we're actually inserting directly to the DB, but we need to query from the DB, which is actually going to help us when we are using the cursor loader. So in the query method, you get the readable database, which actually points to the DB helper get readable database. So this database can be usable. And the cursor will hold the result of the query. So you have to figure out if the URI matcher can match the URI to a specific code. So that's where you use the switch statement, which takes the integer match, which is the URI matcher that takes the URI as a parameter. So the case will either be the pictures or the pictures with ID. So for the pictures, you run a database query that takes the table name, the projection, which is the columns, the selection, where are you pointing at, and the selection arguments. It also takes the sort order. These are the parameters needed to run and return the result of the query, which you actually be passing to the cursor. The same thing goes with the pictures with ID. The selection now will be an ID, which it's not gotten yet. That's why you use the question mark. And the selection argument will be where are you pointing at, which is a string array. You substantiate with a string array, and is the value of the content URI where you pass the ID to the URI. Now you run a database query as well. This time it takes the table name, the projection. We've created the selection up here, and also the selection argument up there with the sort order. It passes down to the cursor. So if the URI matcher is pointing to the pictures, it's run the query. If it's pointed to the pictures with ID, it's also run a specific query. So that's what that's doing. So we actually need the query at this point in time. You need to return the cursor. And in the insert, we may not be inserting because we've actually inserted using the DB helper class. So cool. From here now, we can head straight back to the main activity. Now we understand when we start to talk about some of the methods right here. In the add to DB method that takes the view as a parameter, so that's going to be triggered from the XML. The profile image view will set the drawing catch enabled, so you have to catch the picture, so it has to stay on the profile image view. It's going to build the drawing cache, and now the bitmap is called where you created an object, while the profile image view gets the drawing catch. So this is actually going to be passed into the bitmap. Now let's get to look at something more closely. You call on the byte array output stream, which you instantiate with the new byte array output stream, getting an object called BAOS. So this is what will actually be passed into the bitmap, and you compress that. So let's get to look at the second line. Now you call the bitmap to compress the bitmap compress format, which is JPEG, can be PNG or Word or GIF. The size 200 dp, and the byte array output stream object called BAOS will be passed into that. So now this will actually be converted to bitmap. So let's get to look at what we're going to do in the next line. We declare the byte array with the data object. Now the BAOS is being taken here and converted to the byte array. So you need to convert that to an array before you can pass that into the add to DB method, which is being triggered in the DB helper. We can get to look at that one more time again. The add to DB method takes in the byte array as a parameter before it could insert into the database. So after that, there will be a toast that image saved to the DB successfully. Cool. We can now save you can now save the images into the DB with no glitches. We still need to extend more from here by calling those images back from the database down to the recycler view. That's when we talk about the details activity. In the details activity, this extends the app compact and implements the loader manager with the loader callbacks, passing the cursor as its parameter. This is actually going to implement three methods, which is called the onCreate loader, the onload finished, and the onloader reset, which will be running in the background and never blocks the UI thread. We declare the images adapter since you need an adapter to bind values to. You also need a recycler view that we've actually declared in the details main XML, and an integer of the image loader, which is initialized to 0. In the onCreate method, you set the content view to the details main. You set the recycler view to its corresponding view, over here calling the ID, and you also set the layout of the recycler view to be a linear layout which measures and positions items within a recycler view into a linear list with the instantiating of the linear layout manager. Now you need to initialize the adapter and attach it to the recycler view, where you initialize this and you set that to the recycler view, where you set the adapter. Now you also need to trigger the init loader, which is actually the loader. This is very, very important and must actually sit in the onCreate method. Now the first aspect of the loader is the onCreate loader, where you need to define a projection that specifies the columns from the table we care about, which is the column name. And the loader will execute the content provider query method on a background thread, where you need to return a new cursor loader object. The first parameter is the parent, which is the disk keyword. The second parameter is the provider content URI. The third parameter is the projection, which is the column to include in the resulting cursor. We have the selection clause, the selection argument, and the sort order, which could be null since we are not manipulating the query data. Now on load finish, you call the image adapter, which is actually housing a method called swap cursor, and actually passing the new cursor into the swap cursor. So it actually replaces cursor, and cursor actually holds on to the query data. And on loader reset, the swap cursor sets its parameter to null. So this takes us down to the images adapter, where we are going to bind data to. This extends the recycler view adapter, and we have a generic images adapter which talks to the view order. Now you need some variables for the cursor that holds stacks data and the context, which is the mcursor, and the context, which is for this particular activity. A constructor of the images adapter where you initialize the context. You will also need the onCreate view order that takes the parent and the view type as the parameter, where you get to inflate the image item XML that actually adds the container to store those values, where you return a new images view order and pass the view as a parameter. So now we can bind values, which you do that in the onBind view order. Cool. The indices for the ID, description, and priority columns and so on. So this is how to actually get values from the cursor. The first cursor is the mcursor, where you get the column index, which is the column name. We call that name. You can give that any name. And you have to move to position, which is what? The position of the first cursor. So in this time, we only have one value we're expecting, which is what? The image. And now you call the cursor get blob. Most times you call the get string, get int, get double, and you pass the name of the integer as a parameter. And this will also be saved in a byte array image variable. So let's see how we're going to actually get the image and set that to the image view. Now we created a bitmap with a BMP object. The bitmap factory points down to the decode byte array. We have to decode this, like decompile this, passing the image byte array as a parameter, an index of 0, and also the length, because it's an array which we must have a length, the image length. Now you call the order, which is the view order, the image, which is the image view, and set the image bitmap to the created scaled bitmap. Now you are now creating a scaled bitmap, passing the bitmap as a parameter, that's BMP, and also the size in width and height, 200 by 200, with a boolean of false to end that method. So with this now, the image can be set to the image view, which we have the image here from the order. We have the getter time count that actually counts the cursor, and now the swap cursor that was called from the loader. This checks if the cursor is the same as the previous cursor. That's the if mcursor equals to C. Nothing has been changed. Now if it's a new cursor, it sets that appropriately and triggers the notified data set changed. Cool. Now the images view order class, which is an inner class that houses the views. Now the only view in question is the image view, which has the image object, which actually gets the view, which is the image prof, which is from the details, the item details. So now we could easily understand how to save images to the DB. It could be a daunting task if you're not familiar with this, but once you get yourself acclimatized with this, you understand it once and for all. And you can also call those images back using cursor loader and any other way, or the syntax they run in background, they do in background thread, to actually load those images back to a recycler view or to a detail page or to an image view. So with this, we've ended the tutorial on how to save and retrieve images from the Sqlite database. Before going in the manifest, you need to lock in your provider, very important, with the authorities. And we also use an activity called a detail activity. These are the metadata of your application, very, very important. So from here, I'll be showing the screencast for you to actually see the complete flow of this application. And I'll be dropping the source code in my GitHub account. So you can pick it up, use it, manipulate it, build on it. Before I finish, I have an assignment for every of my good listeners. This is an implementation that is just a standalone. You wonder, where can you implement this? Where can you use this in a real life scenario? I have an employee directory application that still needs an employee picture to be saved to the DB. I will task you to implement this into the employee directory application yourself. See how far you've learned content provider. See how far you've learned the cursor loader. See how far you've gone when it comes to using of the Sqlite database. Try to manipulate this. Do it yourself. But I will also be catching you up in the next tutorial where I'll also be doing it. But I will implore you to try it. Thank you guys. Have a blessed time. Bye bye.